And you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
TASS reports Bangladesh Prime Minister Hasina resigns. Anti-government protests demanding Hasina's resignation erupted anew in the capital city of Bakta and other cities just yesterday. For insight, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, Prothrom Alo Daily reported that the Bangladesh premier had left the country on board a military helicopter for India, while another news channel said she had fled to Finland. Protesters first took to the streets in various cities of the South Asian Republic in early July, demanding the abolition of job quotas for the relatives of participants in the 1974 War of Independence. And the situation in the Republic gradually escalated with protests now turning to violence. What do you see happening in Bangladesh, Dr. Horne, and what do you see the longer-term ramifications of this being?
Well, it's a very complicated scenario that is still unfolding. As we speak, there is veritable anarchy in the streets of the capital of Bangladesh, the eastern neighbor of India. Supposedly, the military, which has played a prominent role in that country's affairs historically, has stepped into the vacuum. Let us trust that they will swiftly return to the barracks, and let us hope that a civilian regime will emerge. This conflict in Bangladesh has major global implications, not least for the aforementioned India. Recall that more than a half century ago, it was India that helped to birth the independence of Bangladesh. Recall that before the independence of Bangladesh, it was part of Pakistan. Look at your map and you'll see that the remaining Pakistan is on the western border of India. At one time, what is now Bangladesh was on the eastern border of India. That was obviously a difficult proposition to sustain, which fed the independence of Bangladesh, as noted more than half century ago. Recall as well that the independence of Bangladesh was not greeted harmoniously, nor with equanimity by the United States, nor by China, because, of course, the United States and China were major supporters of Pakistan, and they thought that the denuding of Bangladesh from Pakistan was ultimately going to aid India, which was then, as now, in the corner of Moscow, the then Soviet Union. Recall as well that as we speak, there's a major question as to who will be the major external beneficiary of this crisis in Bangladesh. That is to say, will there be a resurgence of religious zealotry? Note that Bangladesh, like Pakistan, is predominantly Islamic. Recall as well that Prime Minister Modi in New Delhi has been beating the drums of Islamophobia. And I dare say that many of the folks in the streets of Bangladesh as we speak are not necessarily pro-Modi because of his Islamophobia. Recall as well that the United States now has switched sides, so to speak. It sees China, unlike a half century ago, as a major antagonist, and it may determine that beating the drums in favor of Islamic zealotry, or so-called Islamic fundamentalism, as it is now termed, will, on the one hand, help to weaken India. The United States, although it sees India as a comrade in the anti-China struggle, is quite concerned, to put it mildly and euphemistically, with the recent trip to Moscow of Prime Minister Modi, where he embraced Mr. Putin in a bear hug. And therefore, Washington may see building up opponents to New Delhi in Bangladesh as in their interest. Recall as well that even with regard to Pakistan, there is grumbling in Washington because of Pakistan's remaining and continuing alliance with China. Keep in mind as well that in recent months, if not recent years, there have been attacks on Chinese personnel in Pakistan. As we speak, there is an ongoing political crisis in Islamabad with Prime Minister Imran Khan, the cricketer, under assault, barely in and out of jail on a daily, if not weekly, basis. And so this crisis in Bangladesh, in many ways, is made to order for U.S. imperialism. And I have not even reached the crisis in neighboring Myanmar, that is to say Burma, where it's no secret that the U.S. administration is seeking to assist the destabilization of that military regime, not least because that military regime is administering a territory that borders the People's Republic of China. The United States feels that it helps to destabilize that regime and bring to power its allies. That will be a feather in its cap and help to continue the encirclement of the People's Republic of China. Now, with regard to the presence of Sheikh Hasina, the now defrocked leader of Bangladesh, she, as we understand it, is now cited in India in exile. How long that will last is an open question, because I am sure that her opponents in the streets of Bangladesh will be clamoring for her extradition. She may want to travel onward and westward to Great Britain, where she has relatives, but there hangs a tale because, of course, Great Britain is a poodle-like ally of U.S. imperialism, and it's not clear if they would want to give her exile as a direct result. So this crisis in Bangladesh is paradigmatic in many ways. First of all, with regard to what you saw as the trigger, students surging into the streets objecting to quotas with regard to employment, admission to universities, etc. This is important because, of course, quotas are an issue in neighboring India as well. Quotas and reservations, as they're called, for so-called lower caste forces in that gigantic neighbor of Bangladesh. Not to mention the fact that the role of students underscores their historic role, not only in Bangladesh, but in China more than a century ago, which led to the formation of the Communist Party, in the United States, the anti-Jim Crow movement, in South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement, and so on. And I should also, once again, return to this question of Islamic fundamentalism, so-called. We should not rule out the possibility that despite the fact that on the formal level, Washington sees this religious trend as a kind of antagonist. Recall their hostility to the late Osama bin Laden, who was said to embody that trend. But as matters are evolving, one does not have to be an oracle or have a well-functioning crystal ball to acknowledge and recognize that Washington increasingly is seeing these religious zealots as possible allies. You see that in the Sahel region, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. You see that in Southern Africa with regard to the religious insurgency in Mozambique, which Washington sees as ultimately a draining factor with regard to BRICS member, speaking of neighboring South Africa. So once again, this crisis in Bangladesh is a major international development that we must watch very carefully.
Moving to the other side of the world, Russia invites Venezuela to BRICS Plus summit in October. A lot going on right now with the U.S. imperialism, not having a lot of success in Venezuela, but not giving up. Your thoughts on the importance of this story?
It's a very important story. Once again, we see that Russia, which is hosting the BRICS meeting, is stepping into the breach. We watch with interest the news item emerging from Moscow that Russia is helping to bolster the defenses and perhaps the offensive capabilities of Iran, which is now facing the prospect of yet another thrusting attack by the piratical regime in Israel. And this invitation to Venezuela is a slap in the face of U.S. imperialism, but at the same time, it reflects the fact that Russia is in good company, because standing by the Maduro regime in Caracas are, of course, Cuba and Nicaragua and Iran, Mexico, which is worthy of lengthy dissection in and of itself, not to mention the People's Republic of China. Now, one would think that the Biden regime would seek to reform and revise this dysfunctional policy with regard to Venezuela. It's dysfunctional because the tightening of sanctions against Venezuela is driving Venezuelans out of the country, particularly into North America, particularly into Texas, where the right-wing governor, Governor Abbott, puts them on buses and sends them intentionally and with malice aforethought to mayors, to cities administered by Democratic Party mayors, for example, Mayor Johnson of Chicago, Mayor Adams of New York, which is creating tensions and crises in those two major cities, not to mention the fact that tightening the sanctions against Venezuela hampers the possibility and the capability of this South American oil-producing regime to produce gasoline that will go into the pump, that will keep the price of this precious commodity stable to the benefit of the Democratic Party constituency that's cruising down freeways in Southern California and elsewhere, whereas tightening sanctions, of course, drives up the price of gasoline to the benefit of the oil giants like ExxonMobil and Chevron, which, of course, are dominated by GOP corporate executives. And one would think that Washington would be aware of the fact that driving up the price of a barrel of oil, a barrel of petroleum, ultimately may be in the interest of what they consider to be their antagonists, speaking of Russia, which is a major oil producer. So all in all, U.S. policy towards Venezuela, now enmeshed in a scheme to destabilize this regime, is utterly dysfunctional. Not to mention the fact that given Venezuela's star-crossed relationship with Washington and Washington's attempt to interfere in previous elections, Venezuela has one of the more secure electoral systems in the hemisphere. And so all of these stories that you see in the Washington Post and the New York Times with regard to ballot box stuffing, pay attention to the verbs and pay attention to the subjunctive tense. That is to say, the scattering of words like appears, seems, and might, and may, etc. They're trying to cover their you-know-what. So this crisis in Venezuela, it seems to me, will not end well for U.S. imperialism. This invitation to Mr. Maduro to attend the BRICS summit is increasingly important, and we should also pay attention to whether or not invitations will also be extended to other similarly situated countries like Malaysia, Algeria, Indonesia, etc.
In fact, here is clear evidence of the point you just made about the narrative regarding Venezuela. We're going to get to this with another guest, but this is from the Washington Post today. Maduro lost election. Tallies collected by Venezuela's opposition show. That's the headline. Here's the next line. Edmundo Gonzalez likely beat Maduro in the July 28th election by millions of votes. So the very assertive affirmative statement, Maduro lost, followed by Gonzalez likely beat Maduro. That was in today's Washington Post, Dr. Horne.
Well, we should not be surprised. I guess the good news is that they feel compelled to cover their fantasies by using this weasel-like language, like likely prevailed, so that when it turns out, as it inevitably will, that Mr. Gonzalez did not prevail, they can point to that word and say, well, we didn't say that he convincingly prevailed. So you have to read these stories very carefully and, of course, absorb them with more than a pinch of salt.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
Folks, you are listening.